Maine just launched a program that will pay homeowners up to $10,000 to build a second home on their property. This is a test, and what happens next could decide how Maine and other states try to fix housing and affordability. And by the end of this video, you're going to know exactly what this program is, why it's being trialed, and if it's been successful in other cities in the country that have tried this in the past. This program is called the ADU Boost Pilot Program. It's being tested right now in 3 Maine communities: Bath, Brunswick, and Rockland. And these towns, they were not picked at random. These are places that have struggled with tight rental markets, rising home prices, and limited room for large-scale development. The goal here is actually pretty simple. They just want to add housing faster without having to wait years for zoning to change or large apartment projects to be built. And the tool that Maine is using to do this is the accessory dwelling unit, also known as the ADU. And if you're not familiar with what an ADU is, it's simply an independent home built on an existing property that is completely separate from the main property. Historically, this hasn't been allowed in most communities, but that is something that is changing, and this pilot is proof of that. So now that you know what an ADU is, what the program is called, let's talk about some more of the specifics. Let's start with how the money actually works. So here's what the program actually offers. Homeowners can receive 10% of their ADU construction cost, which is capped at $10,000. So if it costs you $100,000 to build an ADU, you can get the full $10,000 rebate at the end of the program. And for context, the average cost to build an ADU typically ranges from between $150,000 to $300,000, depending on size, site work, and whether it's a conversion or new construction entirely. So when you take that into consideration, that it costs so much to build, $10,000 doesn't seem that significant. And it's not. But that's not really what the point of the incentive is. It's not really meant to change the construction numbers that much here. What it's meant to change is the homeowner behavior. And one other detail that certainly will matter if you plan to take advantage of this program is how the money gets paid out. Well, this money is paid out in 2 different stages. You get 25% of this money after financing is closed and the permits are issued. And you get the remaining 75% after the ADU is fully completed and receives a certificate of occupancy. So, to qualify for this, homeowners must finance the project through a construction loan through Bangor Savings Bank, which is the program's lending partner. And so, as with most government programs, there's always a catch. There are restrictions that you have to follow if you use this program and receive this money to build your ADU. Once you build this ADU, you have restrictions on how you can use these ADUs. Those restrictions are as follows. 1, the ADU cannot be used as a short-term rental, so there's no Airbnb or any other type of vacation rental, which is very common in Maine. And second, homeowners must either live on the property or agree to a 5-year deed restriction requiring the ADU to be rented long-term. These restrictions are not accidental. In multiple other cities that have tried this, early ADU booms were followed by investor conversions into short-term rentals, which increased property values but didn't increase housing availability. So Maine has learned from that and is trying to avoid repeating the same mistake. The goal here isn't more units on paper, it's more units that people can actually live in long-term. So why is Maine doing this now? Maine isn't experimenting because it wants to. It's doing this because the current system isn't producing housing at the pace that demand requires. The state needs tens of thousands of additional housing units over the next decade just to stabilize prices and rents. Here, since 2020, home prices have surged by more than 50% in many parts of the state. Rents have risen sharply alongside that, and wage growth hasn't kept pace. Now, at the same time, new construction hasn't kept up either, not because demand disappeared, but because building became slower, riskier, and more expensive. There have been major labor shortages, there's been more material costs, there's been more lengthy approval requirements, and there's been more financing risk. Maine doesn't have a shortage of land, as 87% of the state is just land. It has a shortage of buildable outcomes, and ADUs are one of the few ways to add housing quickly, incrementally, and without new infrastructure. That's why this program exists and is being piloted this year. Now, this program will not fix affordability by itself. $10,000 doesn't make an ADU cheap to build, but it can change the decision at the margin. It reduces early stage risk, it signals state support, and it makes complicated processes feel more doable by the average homeowner. And we already know what happens when governments remove those barriers. So let's talk about some of the areas that have done this previously and what results they've had. So let's start with Portland, Oregon. Portland legalized ADUs years ago, but construction stayed limited. But where the inflection point came in is when the city reduced upfront fees and development charges. Before incentives, ADU permits hovered in the dozens per year. After costs were reduced, permits jumped into the hundreds annually. Not because of zoning changes, but because friction was reduced. Now let's look at Durango, Colorado. They introduced modest ADU rebates, which were smaller than Maine's program, but the city reported applications exceeding expectations. Dozens of ADUs were built in a town with a fraction of Maine's population. The same pattern, different market. This lesson is consistent. Most homeowners don't need to be convinced ADUs are legal. They just need the final obstacle to be removed. And one of the most well-known areas that have ADUs is California, for obvious reasons. For years, California had one of the worst housing shortages in the country. So instead of waiting on massive apartment projects, the state changed one rule. They made it much easier for homeowners to build ADUs. Permits were streamlined, parking requirements were reduced, cities were limited in how they could block projects. The result was dramatic. Before these reforms, California issued fewer than 1,000 permits per year statewide. After the changes, that number jumped to tens of thousands per year. In some cities, ADUs went from being rare to becoming one of the largest sources of new housing added each year. Did this fix affordability overnight? No, but it did do something critical. It restarted housing supply, fast, incremental, and spread across existing neighborhoods. That's why other states are now copying this model. Not because ADUs solve everything, but because they're one of the few housing policies that consistently turn rules into real home. And Maine isn't just testing ADUs, it's testing whether housing supply can respond again at the household level. The question isn't whether ADUs can be built, it's whether small incentives paired with strict guardrails can reliably turn private property into long-term housing. Will enough homeowners follow through on this? Will units stay in the rental pool? Will incremental supply meaningfully ease pressure? That's what this pilot is meant to measure. And as you probably know, housing affordability isn't broken because of one bad policy. It's broken because supply stopped responding to demand years ago. And Maine is trying to restart that response, one backyard at a time. If this works, it'll scale. If it doesn't, then the state will adjust its position. But either way, this is the direction housing policy is moving in. Because now the question isn't whether states will try this, it's whether it works.